All right. So, Professor Rob Glew, welcome back to the podcast. How are you doing?
It's nice to be here. Thanks, Eric. You're catching me at the end of a very busy semester of I think 4 courses this semester, lots of undergraduates. It's a busy time, but I'm looking forward to the summer. I'm looking forward to watching some movies like this one and talking about them with friends. And so, yeah, I couldn't be more excited to kind of talk about this movie with you today.
Yeah. Thank you again for taking the time, because when I reached out to you, you answered me right away when we had this idea. So we're going to be talking about a movie. I'm going to be leaning on your expertise a little bit to try to pull out some management insights from the film that we chose. And when I reached out to you, you replied with an interesting film. You wanted to talk about the award-winning documentary, American Factory from 2019. I watched it. It's very good. It hadn't crossed my radar when it came out. But why American Factory? Why was that your first reflex to talk about this particular movie?
So I know we're going to talk more about the plot in a second.
Yes.
But I think just for the key kind of headline is it's set in an automotive factory in the US. And we'll explain more, I think, about what that setting is. But I teach and research this notion of behavioral operations management, which you could kind of summarize as saying it's how human behavior affects the performance of processes. So, there's kind of lots of classic things. In supply chains, we have this thing called the bullwhip effect. It's basically, humans are bad at understanding information and making consistent, perfect decisions. So sometimes we get these issues in operations, supply chains, whatever it might be. And so people like me, we're interested in how does that human behavior have real world implications, and how can we, in overall, help humans manage their humanness in not to sound lab rat experiment, but
no, that's true.
We are. It goes all the way back to the behavioral psychology work, right? We are kind of fundamentally flawed in some series of ways. And my interest is in understanding how we can get around that. So, yeah, I think it's an opportunity as a movie to kind of see why we need to consider this combination of human behavior with operations and these kind of elements of culture and social psychology all wrapped up in one very well filmed, beautiful 90-minute documentary.
Yeah, definitely. No, that's a really good point, because often when I end up talking about supply chains, whether it's on this podcast or if I'm writing about it or whatever, we're always thinking about it in terms of systems, and it's a very bird's eye view on things. So it's interesting that you mentioned the humanness piece, because you're right. There's workers who make these factories run and that kind of thing. So the movie documents the takeover of a factory in a small town. So General Motors closes one of their American factories, and a Chinese car windshield company called Fuyao comes in, takes over the factory, rehires a bunch of the workers, hires some new ones, and then that kind of sparks some complicated dynamics between the new Chinese management and the American workers who were there. And they also brought in some workers from China to come work in that factory too, which kind of led to some interesting cultural exchanges as well. So, the movie was maybe 90 minutes long. It's a long documentary. It had a lot to say. So I'm just curious, what stood out to you from the film? What were some of your takeaways?
I mean, some of it is just, it's an excellent piece of observational documentary. Just beyond the kind of, I'm an academic, I have, I see everything with this academic lens. Just the kind of beautiful observational nature of you just film things and let that moment tell its story. So I think there's one or two moments in the movie where the billionaire head of Fuyao, right? This Chinese billionaire who speaks no English and travels around with his attorney/translator, comes to visit the factory, and he has all these very specific preferences, right? I remember at one moment they, this is in, I'm trying to remember, I think it's in Ohio, isn't it? I believe and they have an outdoor event to kind of welcome him, and he sees the stage. They've put a rain cover over the stage. And he says, we must remove the rain cover. Yeah. And I think the factory managers, the American managers, say, well, there's a good chance of rain. This is Ohio. It's November. And he's like, no, it will not rain.
Yeah,
says
I remember
the billionaire.
That. Yeah.
And it's I think moments like that, you don't need any editing, any narration. It really just tells this story that the whole movie, I think, tries to tell of two very different cultures.
Yeah.
And it kind of pivots back and forth. At moments, you feel like it's the American culture that's being criticized, right? The American workers are viewed by the Chinese workers who've come over to help set up the factory, right? I think they have something like 100 Chinese workers and like 500 Americans. And there's points throughout the movie where it feels like it's a critique of American labor standards and American attention to detail. But then it will flip back and suddenly it will be a critique of like the approach to humanity amongst the Chinese and the fact they're expected to just work and work and work, and there's no extra pay for them having come from China to the US, and they struggle to kind of culturally assimilate and enjoy American life. And it's there's no agenda, I think. It kind of pivots back and forth in this way, which I find to be so it's just very, very interesting, different cultural approaches. I think that's the main takeaway.
Yeah, I totally agree that I'm not super sure it comes down one way or another on a lot of these issues. It did make me think about like this philosophy, like maybe, I don't know if when it started to get popular, but like around the 90s, early 2010s, there was this feeling of like, if we can trade with a country like China, for example, where maybe we don't always agree on like culturally, on like the types of like how our politics work and how our how we deal with workers and that kind of thing, and how we treat people and organize our society, that maybe economic exchange would be a vehicle for sort of like, you know, finding common ground and you know, fostering collaboration. It's like this way of deterring war if we can build these kinds of partnerships. You know, what do you think of that whole idea?
I think, you know, you see that really play out, that how difficult cultural assimilation can be, right? There's points in the movie where, I don't know if they do this for the sake of the film or whether they're really doing this, but they have a lot of the American managers have some Chinese manager shadowing them, right? Someone who's come from the Fuyue plant in China to shadow and teach the American kind of the Fuyue way of doing this process, right? Like, I think one of them is the quality control manager. And they kind of go to their home and they show them hanging out together in this very American way, right? I think at one point they get taken to the shooting range and are firing guns. At another point they go fishing and they catch big fish. And it's you know, you see that man to man or woman to woman, this cultural exchange can happen and like actually flourish, right? Not that I would advocate for it, but the Chinese workers absolutely love this idea that they are kind of G.I. Joe, that they can shoot the guns and catch the fish, and it's like a very, you know, this is the America that they kind of dreamt of. So you do see that happening on one level. It would be interesting to know if it went the other way.
Yeah.
You know, if it went the other way, would we have the same, like, the Americans would go to China and they'd assimilate into Chinese culture the same way? I suspect potentially not.
Yeah.
But we never see the kind of counter argument.
That's a good point. Yeah.
But then you have to kind of dichotomize, right? You have the person to person, the cultural exchange kind of flourishes in this setting. But then in an operating system, it's just, as you allude to, kind of culture clash after culture clash after culture clash. Like the Americans require that there's like a safety manager, right? Some kind of health and safety, occupational health inspector who's going around the factory. And in a couple of scenes in the movie, they follow him as he goes around and finds that everything is too loud, everything is too hot. People are working in conditions that legally they should be working in for 2 minutes. They're working in them for 2 hours.
Right.
And he keeps raising these concerns and challenging them. And the pushback from the Chinese leadership and the kind of American leadership who are working with the Chinese is tough on that. And it shows that we are really, you know, which I think what you allude to with your point, it shows that we're all really fundamentally very similar, but the cultures that have been built over thousands of years, they just prioritize and value these different things.
Yeah.
And again, it doesn't necessarily, and I wouldn't want to say one is right and one is wrong.
Yeah,
right?
totally.
I think I would encourage everyone to watch the film because I think it does a really good job of exposing the weaknesses in both approaches, right? how do we balance our need for high quality, cheap products with our desire for like human labor, humans being well paid, well treated, having the same rights as everyone else has.
Yeah, that's it. And that really makes me wonder, well, like, how did the Americans do it then? Because like that was a GM factory for a long time, and a lot of those same people were there, and they would have been dealing with similar questions of like, how do we produce these parts or these cars? I forget what they were actually manufacturing at that particular factory, but they got to do it at a level of quality that's, you know, that meets their standards. And, you know, so Fuyao, the glass manufacturer, so they're trying to achieve similar goals. So then why did it feel like such a failure to the Chinese management compared to maybe what GM might have been running to? But the movie doesn't talk about that.
Yeah,
so
I think it's a really good question. It's like we can speculate, and like maybe last summer I was asked, rather than the movie, and whether it was you or someone else asked me to recommend a book. And I recommended this book called Rivethead.
Okay.
And I think it probably shows the genre of operations management that I'm obsessed with, because Rivethead is the memoir of someone who worked in a GM factory. On the production line, as the name suggests, putting rivets in chassis. That was his, I think it was the Ford F-150 at the time, just riveting together the chassis after chassis, hundreds a day. And that tells the story of, I think that answers the question you're asking of how things really changed. That at the beginning, there was huge profit margins on these vehicles, and people were really well paid in these factories, and the expectations for especially the speed of work weren't as high. And over the career of the author of this memoir, he, I think, tells the story of how there was more and more push to save money, to pay people less. There was more and more push to make things faster, make things better, because the competition was coming in from China, from the rest of Asia, and really challenging the standards in these factories. And eventually it leads GM to lay off a bunch of people at the, I think this was the River Rouge factory, including the author of the book. And it then tells kind of the story of the beginning of the demise of automotive manufacturing in America, which then is where this movie kind of picks up the sequel to. But it shows that this kind of drive for performance and efficiency that was coming in, you know, from the kind of 70s, 80s, 90s, then had this human cost. And there's a reason that GM couldn't compete with the Chinese, and it's the cultural reasons I think we've been talking about.
Yeah. I mean, was it realistic for the Fuyao to expect that their American factory would reach the same level of production capacity and quality that their Chinese factories would have?
So I want to answer that by telling a story. And if people are watching this on YouTube, there's a great YouTube video they can watch about a guy trying to make a barbecue scrubber purely in the US. So his goal was very simple, and it was to make a device you could scrub your barbecue with exclusively with parts made in the US. And that, you know, goes all the way down to the cast metal. And it was an extremely simple device. I think it was like basically a metal stick with some chainmail on the end. And so he wanted the screws made in the US. He wanted the rivets, the links in the chainmail made in the US. Everything, the packaging made in the US. And what they start to realize as they chase after this idea of having this simple thing, what seems like a really simple thing made in the US, is that a lot of the most important skills behind it are disappearing. And I think you see a bit of that in the documentary, that certain steps in the process had never been done in this facility before, had never been done by these workers before, and they fundamentally are not stupid people, are not hardworking people, but it's just that those skills have disappeared from the US in a way they haven't in China. The biggest one is this notion of tool design. So when you do something like make a screw, in order to make a tool, you have a machine tool to make the tool. It's like a complex kind of operations management chain, right? So what is the tool that makes the tools? It's called a machine tool. But there's about I can't remember this. I'd have to check this, but there's fewer than 100 people or something in all of America who are like fully skilled, fully qualified machine tool makers.
Right.
And so the skills like this, which are fundamental, you need to make a factory. A factory is essentially a tool. So you need the people who have the skills to make the tools to go in the factory to make the cars. And that is a very specific, very niche skill that just really is one example, I should say, of things that are disappearing in the West because there's just not enough demand. And so when you watch the documentary, you do see some of this play out.
No, that's it. I mean, what I hear in that too is just a bit of irony, because there's a lot of complaining, especially from the Rust Belt part of the States where I don't want to minimize it to complaining, but these are like just the hollowing out of American industry and then sending it overseas, but then seeing one of those actors from overseas come back and try to, invest as the new managers and in an American factory and kind of try to replace a little bit of what was lost, and then just to see that not quite translating well, and then to hear that maybe that's just a skill that no longer exists in the States or is very rare. It's that's a good point. So then, like, how do you transition an economy as the U.S. claims to want to do to be more locally, ambitious, more locally prosperous, and I know Canada is having a lot of conversations around that too. So it does raise interesting questions about that. But
I think just to kind of pick up on that point, I think that there's one way to watch this documentary is to sit and think, well, the Americans are terrible, right? All they want to do is get paid, do the minimum work, show up, go home. They're not invested in quality and productivity the same way the Chinese are. That's one way to read it. But I think if you came to me as a consultant client and asked me for my advice on this entire endeavor, I'd say you can't do this. Like, what you're trying to do is fundamentally, obviously flawed. You can't just pick up something that works somewhere in the world and move it somewhere else with different people, different economics, different pressures, and expect to just, okay, we did X, Y, and Z in China. Let's pick it up and we'll do exactly X, Y, and Z in the US. And if it doesn't work, it's the Americans' fault for not being Chinese. Yeah. I think that is the real way to read and watch this movie. And it's the individual workers, whether they're Chinese or American, even the managers, the town, are just caught up in this story of misunderstanding about what we can and can't replicate. And anyone who's traveled between any cultures for any extended period of time, right? Even I find this myself, coming from two very similar cultures, much more similar than China and the USA, right? From the UK to Canada, I still find that you obviously can't just pursue everything exactly the same way you did before, right? XYZ in the UK does not give you the same output as XYZ does in Canada. And so that doesn't mean now that, you just can't do this in America. You can't make things in America. But it means you have to think, what is it we're trying to do and why? Yeah,
that's it. I never got the impression that the workers were incapable of doing it. I just felt like, there are different conditions that they're used to, maybe. And then there's also, just from the very beginning, like I just remember when they opened up the factory and trying to recruit workers, and one of those recruitment presentations, one of the prospective workers was asking, like, "Oh, is this a union job?" Because that's something that he valued. Because he's used to being in a situation where he might be exploited by his managers on the factory floor. So and then in China that doesn't exist. Like, that was a confusing concept to a lot of the managers that came over to the States, and they worked very hard to kind of scare off the workers from trying to unionize, and then they failed their union vote by the slimmest of margins. I think it was like 51% or something like that, and that they voted against unionizing. So it's just kind of interesting to see those dynamics play out about a culture that has a long history with unions and that kind of thing, versus one that doesn't have that kind of worker organization. They can argue that they don't need it. We can leave that there, but Yeah, I just thought that dynamic was kind of interesting.
Yeah, exactly. Like the union dynamic is, especially in the latter half of the film, it plays a big role of this. Will they, won't they unionize? What will be the effect of them unionizing? And things like the health and safety, I think we mentioned earlier, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like they want to unionize because they want to be prevented from having to spend 2 hours inside a furnace they should only be spending 2 minutes in, or that they should not have to work in such loud, noisy environments with this machinery. And those are things that I think people they're totally valid to want, right? A safe and pleasant work environment. And it goes to show, again, this point of just cultural differences. I think no one is saying that the union is exclusively good. No one is kind of saying it's exclusively bad, but the expectations, the definitions are just different in the two groups, between the Chinese from original Fuyao and the kind of American laborers.
Well, I
and
feel like
workers.
the movie maybe is taking a stance on this stuff.
Yeah.
I feel like the way the movie presents it, it's very much a pro-union kind of, because I walked away from that film feeling like we're all united under the exploitation of capitalism. Like, it just felt like no matter who you were, if you were a Chinese worker or if you were an American worker working on the factory floor, it's work to resist like that push towards a productivity that might put you in harm's way. But I don't know. I'm curious if you walked away with the same feeling, but that felt to me to be a big message from the film, at least.
Yeah, I think so. And I think that again, this is the how do you read it? There's many different dynamics.
Yeah.
I think this is why it's such an excellent movie to just kind of sit and absorb. And
Totally.
It's a weird movie to sit and watch because it is just kind of watching how stuff's made for 90 minutes.
Yeah,
with no
right.
commentary.
It is a bit of a fly on the wall kind of thing. It's totally.
But yeah, I think that because they spend so much time with the Americans and with the Americans trying to unionize, they make a very compelling case for the union. And in theory, the Chinese should just be saying, well, how can it be a bad thing for the laborers to want safety and want rights? And I think it's more tells the story of the culture clash, that they don't understand, I think, why people want to unionize. Because, as you said, unions aren't a huge thing in other parts of the world. And so for the Chinese, they view the union as, they want to unionize because they want to go on strike.
Mm-hmm.
And the workers would say, no, we want to unionize because we want safe working conditions and we want to have fair pay and we want to have reasonable working hours and we want days off. And the union just gives them the rights to negotiate that. And I think that both of those are probably misrepresentations. There's the truth always lies somewhere in the middle with these things, that there is an element of the union does give them the power to go on strike and negotiate very strongly. So, I think it
was interesting to see that tension play out, because I think those are real conversations that happen in any factory where unions kind of, or where workers are thinking about unionizing. And it was kind of interesting to see that tension between, management and the workers, and then plus with the added cultural element to it. It was, But
then you see with the union dynamic, the automation dynamic playing out at the same time, which is kind of management's card they have in their back pocket of, well, okay, if you're going to make it difficult to employ people, we would just have fewer people. And that is something that has become this precedent of response to unions everywhere.
So then what's the lesson here? So if you're an ops manager and you're listening to this conversation, and maybe you've seen this movie, what do you think are some takeaways for that person that they might be able to apply to their job?
So I think I'm going to try and stay in my lane and not comment on the international management and the cultural aspects. And it would be great to hear what my colleagues and what people who know much more about that area think of this movie than I do, because I'm a math guy, really. I view this as a systems and processes and efficiency movie. And I think the takeaway from that is, yes, I can sit in my office and imagine that everything is beautifully mathematical and beautifully repeatable, but that when things get implemented in the real world, they are messy and difficult, and there's things that you can't account for. And if you go all the way back to the Ford Model T, which we spoke about earlier, right? Yes, they had this beautiful production line, the first production line really ever, but also they were spending over an hour reworking every car at the end of the production line, which basically means hitting the panels with hammers so they fit better together because they were all misshapen. So you can have this kind of beautiful efficient mathematical view of how processes should work. But I think anyone who is doing the kind of work I do in operations management, operations research, needs to appreciate that at some point, your beautiful mathematical models interfaces with the very messy real world. And as we get better as a field at collecting data and spending time in the real world, and data becomes more available, we're learning ways in research to combine these two things, to include the way humans behave, not as a disadvantage to our systems, but as an advantage.
Well, Professor Rob Glew, this was a lot of fun. So that's American Factory from 2019. That was the movie we just finished talking about. This is different from what we normally do. I'm talking to the camera now, to our audience who might be watching on YouTube. If you liked this, leave us a like, drop us a comment, do all the things. Let us know if you want more of this, because this is a little different from what we do normally. But I had a lot of fun. I'm grateful that you suggested this movie. I learned a lot from it. Yeah, thank you for your time.
No, thank you, Eric. It's always a pleasure. Thank you.